Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us here on LinkedIn or YouTube or wherever you're happen to be joining us from. Um, I wanted to take the opportunity to go live today to try and cut through some of the frankly the shenanigans that have been dominating the news over the last couple of days. I mean, I think there's a lot we could unpack from that perspective, but that's not really my focus or the focus of my work. Um, Really, I think, I'm happy to take questions or to talk further about that, at a later time in terms of the political fallout, in terms of the impact, on various players and political fortunes. I will say maybe a couple of things. One is that, I think this obviously furthers, existing pressure that was already on the prime minister to step aside, kind of reinforces all that we've already seen around existing environment of precarity and polarization that we've been talking about all fall and encouraging people to prepare for. So, I'm not going to delve into the minutiae of what the impact of all of the various things that went down. I think maybe one thing that I would just say, I think to put it in context, that I think is interesting for those who are following it from a more pragmatic government relations perspective, which is what I really want to be talking about today, is that it's good to keep in mind that budgets and economic statements are their main purpose from a government perspective is communications. Often, there's a lot of different ways the government can make funding announcements and introduce legislation, and that's the regular business of government. So the idea really of having a budget or a fall economic statement is to be a highlights reel, to really emphasize, well, these are the issues that are most important to us. This is an overall kind of check-in on where things are at. And usually it's the government in power who prepares it, so it's their chance to kind of put a best foot forward and say these are all the great things we're doing, and kind of absent having an actual election platform, it's the kind of closest thing to a direct policy pronouncement. So just to put it in perspective, maybe I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. I'll just briefly introduce myself as well. My name is Jessie Clark. Pronouns are she, her. I am a government relations consultant based in Toronto who focuses on issues of concern to Canada's nonprofit and charitable sector. And that's the context in which I'm giving you these remarks today. I'm going to talk for a few minutes and try and summarize for me what I think is getting lost, in a lot of the current discussions, which is the actual substance of what was announced in the fall economic statement and some of the context around that. Happy to take a few questions as well. Not planning for this to go at the very longest more than half an hour or so. If you're interested in this kind of content, please do follow me on LinkedIn. I will also share on this within the comments of LinkedIn Live. I'll share a link to subscribe to our newsletter and also to enroll in a new professional development community I've created for professionals working in Canada's charity and nonprofit sector who are interested in learning more about government relations and how it impacts your work. That's being open for registration right now. That'll be launching in January, where you'll have access to certainly my thoughts, but also an opportunity to ask questions about your work specifically, as well as receive some resources and tools and additional insights that are more substantive and detailed than I offer in these kinds of LinkedIn Lives. So just wanted to mention that as well. But yeah, to think about a little bit about the fall economic statement. So typically this is something where, as there usually is, there was a lockup. They bring in people who they would expect to have a more positive reaction. And there's certain groups who are invited no matter what, I think, to participate usually and who are expected to be commenting. I think one of the main narrative that really emerged in the media, other than, the resignation of the finance minister following Monday, was what was seen by many to be an alarming increase in the deficit. I think that at this stage, I think there are a lot of lengthy debates, and there's been a lot written over the years about whether or not the deficit is something that should concern average Canadians, or whose interests it really affects. And I think there are some. I'm not going to really go into the substance of that particularly right now. I think there's kind of a couple of key take-home points I want to bring forward on that front. One is that I think obviously optically it's not great that they had said there would be a ceiling previously of $40 billion, and they're now bumping that much higher. As often is the case, there's a lot of justification for that. That's a big portion of the first part of the 279-page full economic statement, is explaining, kind of putting all of that in context, explaining where Canada's position vis-a-vis other G7 countries, and giving a bit of background as to why we have why the government has decided to allow that significant deficit, and some of which is factors within, and some they argue are factors outside their control. So I'm not really going to talk about that, but I think it's interesting, and that's the main narrative that's emerged. And to my mind, that's concerning, because I think what we've often seen in Canada is ballooning deficits, preceding or providing rationale and justification for austerity measures in government, for substantial cutbacks. And I think that's something you can see kind of a little bit across the political spectrum. I mean, we've certainly seen Liberal and Conservative governments who have used ballooning deficits as justification for those kinds of measures, that have had quite a strong and often quite a negative impact on social services sectors, on nonprofits and charities in many parts of Canada. So I think given the overall environment and, what is clearly, we're trending towards, very likely seeing a Conservative government at some point in the next year or so in Canada, it is concerning from that standpoint. Whether you sort of agree with the concern around deficits or not, I think the narrative around that is of concern, because it lays out sort of a narrative of not being fiscally responsible that people might want to then react against by putting into place measures of fiscal responsibility. So that's what I wanted to say about that. But what I really wanted to focus on today particularly was what is actually the content that is in the full economic statement that's of interest to the sector. And I'm just going to give a quick overview. So there's a lot in there, and I can't really be comprehensive on all of it. As I say many times, I am not a CPA, I am not a lawyer, and there are some substantive legislative changes and tax changes that I think people should, really delve into with the filter of experts who are experts more in those areas. But I do want to give you a few highlights. First of all, as well, and I also just wanted to kind of give you a bit of a user-friendly technical note on how to engage with these kinds of documents, because we get these documents a couple of times a year in provinces and federally in Canada. It's sort of intimidating when you download a PDF I think it's 279 pages, and kind of think where to start. I recommend keyword searches are invaluable for this kind of thing, if there's particular topics you're interested in. I found helpful in this particular fall economic statement document that they use this little bullet that actually looks like a dollar sign whenever they were actually highlighting things that were new announcements in this fall economic statement, because often this kind of statement will recycle a lot of existing commitments, right? Because they're framing it within an existing narrative. So look for those little dollar signs, and that will give you a bit of an idea of what are the new things coming out of this particular statement. And in this particular case as well, there was an annex on legislated measures. This does not include the funding announcements, but it talks about some of the legislative changes that are highlighted. If you go to Annex 3, and they provide a quick summary of all of those, which is helpful as well. So just some tips for people who want to try and get through this. And then I just want to give you a few highlights of what was covered, first in terms of legislative measures, and second in terms of funding announcements that were mentioned in the fall economic statement. So first of all, one of the things that I found quite interesting and actually kind of encouraging was they're really planning to press forward on the idea of making automatic tax filing for people who are living at really, really low income levels a reality. with the idea that they may even have, revenue CRA send out already completed tax forms. People just ask them to sign off on them, and as a result, people who maybe haven't been filing taxes because they're underneath that low income threshold, or they can't afford to pay an accountant to prepare taxes, or many structural reasons, internet access, they can't buy the software, all of these things, to make it much easier for them to file taxes, which then will make them eligible for all of the different kinds of benefits that are available, like GST rebates, like the child care benefits, child benefits, disability benefits, all of these things that people may otherwise not be able to access. So I think that's a really encouraging kind of anti-poverty measure, and a very substantive sort of technical measure. They've also noted they're going to be making the disability benefit tax exempt, which will allow folks who receive this payment to be eligible for other supports, such as the child benefit, or more eligible. They also mentioned a continued crackdown. This has been an ongoing process, so I'm not really sure what the substance of this particular announcement is, but those who are experts may know more. But cracking down further on predatory lenders, payday loan type places that charge exorbitant interest, and also cracking down further on credit advisors who recommend these kinds of lenders. So I thought that's all kind of good news for people who are living in poverty. I would say also, there's a number of funding announcements around housing, and a lot on housing, because of course this is a primary political preoccupation for good reason right now. Again, I'm not a housing policy expert. There are maybe even some who are on this call, on this live right now, who could chime in. But a couple of things I wanted to note was that they had allocated money, $50 million specifically to an affordable housing fund for pre-development work, for affordable housing providers who are getting ready to develop new housing, and $50 million for specifically to increase spaces in women's shelters for those fleeing gender-based violence. So those were just a couple of points around housing specifically. More in terms of legislative measures, and I know that there are a number of organizations in Canada, including in the international development sector, who've been really lobbying heavily around removing forced labor from supply chains, and really getting the government to strengthen measures around that. And that they were very happy to see there were a couple of strong measures in this particular fall economic statement. One saying that they're basically going to strengthen the existing legislation, or actually, no, I'm sorry, introduce legislation to strengthen the import ban on goods produced using forced labor. But in addition to that, they're also going to be strengthening the due diligence requirements for corporations and governments to look at their own supply chains and make sure none of the goods that they are producing or using are coming from forced labor. It's a regulatory framework, and it relies a lot on compliance, but the more that they can strengthen it, the better hope there might be of actually, increasingly, removing any funding that's going to inadvertently fund some of these really terrible practices. So encouraging to see that. There's also a note that the government is proposing to amend the customs tariff, to allow that if there are certain goods that are coming into Canada that are being donated to a registered charity, they can be exempt from some of the tariffs, or at least get an opportunity to recover duty from those donations if they're going to be used for the organization's charitable programs. Not maybe massively important to a lot of organizations, but there certainly are organizations for whom that will be a welcome measure as well. So then I just want to turn quickly now to a few funding announcements. And there weren't, again, there's not actually, for all that it's a 279-page document, it's a fall economic statement. So it's not that there's a massive amount of new measures in this. But there were a few things that I thought were worth highlighting. Interesting that they focus specifically on high school STEM programming, $3 million for SHAD Canada, for those who are aware of that program, but also more broadly, a $35 million investment for a new talent for innovation program, which is all about funding both research and development, but also supporting employers and also organizations that support skills development and training focused around areas of technological innovation. So I think that could be quite interesting for organizations that work on employment. There was a lot of excitement within those who've been lobbying around reproductive and sexual health in Canada. There's an announcement that $90 million in funding has been earmarked to Health Canada to create what they're calling a permanent sexual and reproductive health fund, which is encouraging because it's trying to ring fence commitments to some of this work, no matter what changing political context we might see. and an additional $15 million in funding to WAGE, Women and Gender Equality Canada, to strengthen women's organizations. And they've already had quite a bit of funding over the past several years that's been specifically focused on building sector capacity and building the capacity of organizations. Then the other thing that I thought was interesting was a series of announcements in support specifically of Black Canadians as well. There's $77.9 million for a whole of government Black justice strategy. If this is an area that touches on your work, I really recommend you dig into that section of the economic statement and read through, because it's touching a number of different departments. And I really think there could be a lot of really interesting funding opportunities in there for organizations that serve Black youth in particular. So certainly worth delving further, understanding it better. And then in addition to that, there's some funding for ESDC, Employment and Social Development Canada. There's $9.5 million that's been earmarked specifically for a Black youth employment and skills strategy program, as well as a broader $36 million for the Supporting Black Canadian Communities initiative, which includes quite a wide range both of Black-led organizations, but also measures to fight anti-Black racism in specific organizations within including in the nonprofit and charitable sector. So that is a lot of information, but really I just wanted to give you some quick highlights so that you had an idea of what to look for if you're going to delve into the document. And again, I think for charities and nonprofits, I want to put all of this in a bit more context again, and sort of why does this matter to you, or why is this of interest to you right now? So a couple of things. One is it's important to keep in mind that these commitments are being announced right now. They then need to be actually enacted and rolled out in legislation. So if, for example, there was a snap election early in the new year, which is something that's being potentially speculated about, that means that not all of these commitments would be fulfilled. So it's important to keep that in mind. But the intention right now for the government is, if they have another 6 months or so of a mandate, they are intending certainly to legislate and to make all of these changes over time, but they still need to sort of pass all of these legislative changes through the House. So that's an important piece of context. I think the other thing to keep in mind is if you see things in there that are of interest to you and your organization, this is a great moment to reach out and say, to the relevant ministries and say, we welcome this announcement. This is a great opportunity to say, we would love to meet with you to learn more about what this could mean for our work. A great avenue, an opening for writing a letter and asking for a meeting for more senior officials, ministers, or minister staffers, etc. So you can follow up further on some of the things that were noted in this document as well. So that's also a useful thing that we can pick up on as nonprofits and charities to make use of this for our own lobbying and advocacy. It's also, it can be also a valuable time to say, these particular measures we welcome. If there are some that are relevant to your work, this is a chance to publicly state that, actually we recommended some of these changes and we're really happy to see them, being fulfilled. And you'll see some organizations that have been really fighting hard for things like the reproductive health measures or, the forced labor measures that have already been doing that. It's kind of part of the expected, if you've been lobbying for something and you see it turn up in something like the economic statement or budget, you want to make sure that you're then giving kudos, where it's deserved and following up. So those are some kind of practical hints, I think, on how you can make use of something like this. And why these documents, they are important, even though, as I said at the beginning, they're primarily communications documents. I mean, this is not the only way the government communicates about funding opportunities, about legislative changes, about increased investments, but it's a more public facing way and a more accessible way, and a great way maybe to engage public and your supporters to either thank the government or criticize the government if there are things that were not mentioned. And I would of course be remiss as well if I mentioned that, I mean, this was, as I said before, this was a bit of a thin document in my view, as far as any kind of substantial commitments around anything to do with international, development, humanitarian assistance. It's very little in there aside from mention of Ukraine and the forced labor piece as well. Very, very little in terms of sort of broader investments around, education. I mean, more from a, post-secondary education standpoint or youth funding. And and housing, I mean, yes, of course, there were some announcements, but again, nothing really substantive. And I think that's not uncommon with a fall economic statement, which is usually a kind of a budget light. So I just wanted to highlight, take this moment where, you know, everyone's kind of paying attention to all of the noise and, you know, back and forth and political machinations, and just to focus on the actual content and what might be relevant for those who are working in Canada's charity and nonprofit sector. And of course, if you have questions, please feel free to throw up questions now, or feel free to reach out to me if you have questions. I'm also going to be sending in a newsletter that goes into this in a little bit more depth. So please do subscribe, and I'll post a link in the comments to subscribe. And I for the kind, you know, if you want more on these kinds of tips, say if you want templates or tools on how to respond, kinds of examples of letters you can use to send to government, examples of memos you can use to brief people within your organization on why this is important, I recommend you join our membership, where you'll have access to those kinds of substantive tools and resources. So I am going to open it up just for a few minutes. I haven't seen anyone post any questions, but I also sometimes hard for me to see all of that when I'm broadcasting via StreamYard. So if there's anything or anyone wants to add any comments, do feel free to do that now. And I'll just give you a minute or two. Otherwise, I'll wrap up shortly. All right, well, I'm going to end today. Please feel free to send me your thoughts, add comments into this. This live will be available, can be reposted on LinkedIn and shared with others, and or to send me messages if you have questions or concerns, or feedback at all as well. Really appreciate that, and really appreciate your engagement and participation. Thank you so much, and I hope everyone has a restful holiday season and there aren't too many major developments or shenanigans. Oh, I do see one question. Thank you from Margot Stevens. If their own MP is in opposition right now, yeah, that's a good question, because if you want to try and engage with your local politicians, that's something I always recommend, because they're naturally inclined to be much more responsive to people who live in their riding and who are their own representative, you know, their own constituents. I think if your MP is in opposition, it doesn't mean you can't reach out. I think you can reach out and say, we saw some announcements that were of interest. There were some things lacking. Can we meet with you and talk about what we would have liked to have seen as our organization in this particular budget or in this particular economic statement that was missed? It's a great time to be reaching out to opposition members in general right now, as I've mentioned in previous lives around opposition strategy. You want to keep building up those relationships as much as you can right now, because you never know where they're going to end up and how you're going to be able to call on them in the future. So the more kind of positive foot forward engagement on and substantive education around your issues, the better, I think, is really helpful. Yes. Okay. So John Alves, great question there. And that's always like a big concern for people in the sector who receive and who rely on government funding. So how likely is it that a new Conservative government would backtrack on existing funding commitments already made, including signed contribution agreements with recipients? So there's a couple of different things I would say about that. I think, as I mentioned a little bit earlier in this live, pronouncements and announcements that are made in a document like this fall economic statement, they're really only going to be, enacted if the government has time to legislate them into force in the coming months. Otherwise, I think a new government coming in has carte blanche to, especially with sort of pre-existing commitments that have not been already legislated. I mean, they likely would not follow many of those unless they for some reason align with their own political interests, or had really been subject to heavy lobbying. Basically, it's up to a new government coming in. They can build on what's already there if there's issues they want to support, or they can completely scrap it and start fresh. So it's a big question. But in terms of funding commitments that have already been made and signed contribution agreements, that's a bit more complicated. And what I would say about that is that I think, first of all, even existing governments can always, make changes to funding agreements and contribution agreements, even when they're already in place. And we've seen that throughout the history of federal governments in Canada, that there are times when priorities shift dramatically. I think that we saw that a lot during COVID, for example, when the government had to shift money around within the government to be able to provide some of the COVID relief measures. It meant that some people faced reductions in their contribution agreements. So it does happen. I think that as a rule, often what I find when new governments come in, and I think other people who've been in the civil service also can speak to this, there's the minutiae of government. There's a lot to take on when you're coming in as a new government. And it takes time for the new government to get up to speed and understand everything that's out there and all of the details, and what may or may not be, worth a focus or worth making changes. So I say that in the sense that it is not to say that, ultimately a new government could change many, many things. I think they're going to tend to be more focused on enacting new legislation and going forward, and less kind of on looking backwards and making changes to things that have already happened. Just as from a communications perspective, for example. However, if they get there and they find out, well, there's not money to do for these commitments, that's when they will sometimes go and say, well, we actually, this was indicated, but we're changing direction on this issue. And they do have latitude to do that. I do think that something already being signed, already being announced, already being enacted does give it more protection, and more chance that will be carried on, just because bureaucratically and just from a governance standpoint, it's much harder to change things that have already been signed or put out there. It takes more work and creates kind of more churn and more, more kind of, extra hassle, frankly, for those who are in power. But if it means the difference for them in terms of freeing up funding they need for new commitments, they will certainly do that, if they need to. So that's how I would answer that. A bit of a non-answer, but it's a complicated question for sure. Before I wrap up, just to see if there's any other questions. Otherwise, I'll just wrap up now. All right. Well, thanks so much, everyone. And thanks also for those who asked questions. And please do feel free anytime to reach out to me. I'm happy to have a chat and talk about how we can support you as well with our work. My firm does a lot of strategy and grant writing for charities and nonprofits, and always happy to talk to you about the kind of services we have available as well. And please do follow us, and happy to take questions at any time. So thanks, and have a good holiday. And maybe it'll be nice and peaceful, and we won't have too many political upsets for these couple of weeks. I like to hope so, but look forward to speaking to everyone again in January and seeing where the dust has settled. Thank you.